Simon, congratulations on the movie.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you, I think the X-Men franchise is one that people keep on wanting to see more of. So what is the appeal for you, and what do you think audiences want to see more of?
I think it's the same as when I was a kid reading the comics. They're great characters. I think the way they were drawn in the comics, I mean, not literally drawn, but the characters were drawn emotionally. They're diverse characters. They have different sort of points of view on things. They're different generations. It's just a very rich collection of characters. And then I think the other part of it is it's a story about outsiders. It's a story about people that don't fit into society despite the fact that they are more powerful than the people who run society. And I think the conflict in there is just endlessly entertaining and interesting.
Were you treating this film as part of the end of a trilogy, or did you see that there were going to be more episodes in terms of introducing new characters who we might get to see more of?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that we get to keep making movies with Michael Fassbender, McAvoy, Jen Lawrence, and Nick Hoult. I mean, that's my dream because I love working with those actors. I love writing for them. But we also were treating this as the end of one trilogy and the beginning of something new. We were treating it as the end, at least, of the trilogy we began with First Class and Days of Future Past and this, with those four main characters of Magneto, Charles, Raven, and Hank, and the introduction of equally iconic characters, especially Scott, Jean, and Storm. So I was treating it from the beginning of the conceptual phase as not a handing of the torch from one generation to the next, but certainly this feeling of how do we complete the arcs of these characters now for whom it's their third movie, and how do we start the arcs of these new characters.
I think it's great to have a character like Wolverine who can come and go and stay as a constant as well in some ways.
Yeah.
But did you feel any pressure to put him into this film, and how did you go about creating that particular sequence?
There were a lot of different versions. I didn't feel pressure to put Wolverine in this movie because I feel like there's so many great characters in the X-Men universe that we probably could have made a movie without Wolverine, and it still would have been an engaging film. I love the character, and I adore Hugh as a human being. And so I wanted him to be in the movie because I thought it would only be additive. And we talked about a lot of different versions, in truth. Bryan Singer and I, when we sat down and started sort of trying to hammer out the story for the film, there was a version where he got introduced in the middle of the movie and became this sort of drill sergeant for the kids, but that felt like it stepped on Raven's role as becoming the leader to the kids. There was, there were 2 or 3 different incarnations, iterations that we tried, and none of them felt quite right. And we talked to Hugh about it too. And then as we were constructing the movie, we always imagined that they were abducted and taken somewhere. And so we came up with this idea that they were taken to Alkali Lake, and that Weapon X would be there, and that you would see something that we've never really seen in these movies before, which is the full-on, out-of-control, animalistic, stripped-down Wolverine. And that suddenly became very interesting to us, and this notion that there could be a moment between him and Jean, knowing their history and knowing their future, us knowing their history and future, that could be really rich as well. And so once that sort of clicked for us, suddenly we had an idea that we got excited about. And I think actually Bryan and I were here in London 2 Christmases ago, working on the script, thinking about it, and that clicked for us when we called Hugh and we pitched to Hugh, and Hugh said, I love it, I want to do that.
There's a couple of sequences I think that have an incredible resonance, which are quite rare in superhero films, I think, which is the scene in Poland and the scene in Auschwitz as well. How did you go about bringing that into the film? Because it's not something you kind of expect in this genre, so to speak.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Bryan did from the beginning of the franchise is, look, he started these movies in Auschwitz with the little boy losing his parents. And so it sort of announced that this would be a different kind of a genre film, let alone superhero movie, that it would be more dramatic, it would be more intense than anything people had seen before. And the idea for this notion that Eric has a family and loses his family within the context of this film came from a conversation Michael Fassbender and I had on the way from here, London. We had the Days of Future Past premiere, and then we went to Moscow to do a premiere there, so two summers ago. If that's right, yeah, gosh. Feels like 10 summers ago, but it was 2. And we were on the plane, just the 2 of us, and we were talking about what's the most surprising place you could start Magneto at the beginning of this film. As a terrorist, who is he after Days of Future Past? And what we struck on and suddenly got very excited about was the opposite of what you expect of him, that he's actually a family man, and he has a daughter, and he has a nice life, and he drives a sort of, crappy car and works in a factory, but it's enough for him. He's found the family he lost in Auschwitz, and that seemed really compelling and interesting and surprising. And then the natural place you would take that to is you strip it all away from him, you take it away from him, and then you see what he becomes. And so for me, when we started talking about it, I think in very structural terms as a writer. And I thought, that's where you begin the movie. The end of the first act, for me, is the scene where his family's killed in the woods, which is my favorite scene. It was my favorite scene in the script. It's my favorite scene I've ever written, actually, as an actor. I mean, as a writer. And it's my favorite scene in the movie. And his performance in the scene is just extraordinary. And so once we made that decision, then when Apocalypse comes to him and tries to recruit him to become one of his horsemen, we felt like taking him back to his sort of primal terror, the place where he lost family for the first time, and giving him an opportunity to have to face that and then wipe it away, quite literally and then also emotionally, just felt like right for the character.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Four Horsemen there. How did you go about picking those? Were they based entirely on the comics, or did you think about a new formation for them?
Well, the comics has lots of different formations of them. So, I mean, we had sort of a list of the ones that were the most prominent, and there's been different ones over time. And Bryan and I also, when we work on these movies, we look at the cartoons as well. The cartoons are something that Bryan grew up on and loves, and I like them a lot too. And so there are yet more different horsemen in those iterations. We knew Archangel would be one of them from the beginning. We felt very strongly that Storm should be one of them because we loved this idea of seeing a character go from what you think is going to be a hero, but start as essentially a villain in her introduction. So that we knew from the beginning. We really loved the idea of making Eric Magneto one of the Horsemen. Just because you've never seen Magneto as a follower. He's such a leader in these movies that it felt like it would empower Apocalypse. And it would also give Eric an opportunity as well to arc over the span of the film. He starts the film, trying to have one kind of life. He loses that. He goes to the darkest of dark sides, and yet is sort of drawn back by his original family in the X-Men by the end of the film. And then the last one that we came up with was very late in the game. At one point, Bryan and I felt like maybe because of Charles's abduction in the middle of the movie, we could sort of posit Charles as the fourth horseman, even though he wasn't willingly. And we played with that for quite a while, and then felt like it was sort of a cheat because he wasn't a willing horseman, and just the image of it wasn't as strong. And then we looked down the list and thought Psylocke is a character that both Bryan and I have wanted to see in a proper way in one of these movies. So we thought of Psylocke. And I had just totally coincidentally a week earlier had a meeting with Olivia Munn to talk about Deadpool, actually, at the time. We were talking about casting her in one of the roles of Deadpool. That didn't work out, but I thought she's perfect for Psylocke. And then Bryan was like, familiar with her work, but not that familiar. And so we went online and did like a Google image search of her. And one of the first things we saw when we did the search was fan art of her as Psylocke. And so I emailed her and I said, hey, do you want to play Psylocke? And she was like, 100%, I'm in. I know everything about the character.
It's interesting you mentioned Deadpool and the influence of fans and fan art, so to speak. How has the success of that, has that surprised you at all? Because obviously it's been huge.
It was shocking. I'm the producer of that movie, and I'll tell you, I'm very proud of Deadpool. I was excited about it from the beginning because it is so different and provocative. I thought it would be successful because I thought the movie was good, and I'd been in enough test screenings where audiences were laughing their asses off and actually liked the movie a great deal. It was one of the best testing movies I've ever had. But the actual level of success, none of us anticipated. Ryan, Tim Miller, myself, the writers who'd worked on it for 10 years, the studio, even when we were looking at the tracking numbers, which give you an indication of a movie's going to open, we thought, Jesus, we could open at $70 million, which would have been mind-blowing for a movie that cost, 50-something. So to do the way it did, and actually to do better than any X-Men movie ever, was a shocker.
Does that put pressure on this movie then to do better than Deadpool?
No, I don't think so. I think this movie is up against other X-Men movies. Deadpool is its own animal, and I think Deadpool just came at a time when there was nothing else like it, and the world was ready, I think, because of all of these superhero movies to sort of embrace a movie that made fun of them. So I see it as very separate and different from the X-Men.
Excellent. And finally, I just want to ask you about Star Wars, which I know you're involved in. What kind of, I mean, it must be such a huge playground for you to play in. How do you kind of focus on one idea and one story to work on?
On Star Wars?
Yeah.
It's a huge playground. I mean, it's the biggest mythology of our time, even more than the comic book realm. I don't know, I feel like I go with the things that are most interesting to me, and I hope that fans have a similar inclination. I grew up loving Star Wars. I mean, it's the reason I wanted to get into movies, was actually seeing Empire Strikes Back. That's when I decided I wanted to do something to do with film. I had no idea what. I didn't know what it meant to be a filmmaker. I was a child. But there are characters, and there are storylines, and there are planets that I grew up loving and being fascinated by, and those are the things I focus on. So you just sort of follow your own fanboy fandom and hope that others have the same taste.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, man. Pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey,